And it's wonderful to really introduce somebody who is one of the most eminent pediatric cardiothoracic surgeons and transplant surgeons at Great Ormond Street to come and give the next talk. He's a phenomenal person, as I'm sure you'll understand when you hear his talk. He's retired from Great Ormond Street, but that hasn't stopped him from continuing to do amazing work as non-executive director of the Royal Marsden NHS, as chief medical officer of Allocate Software, and also non-executive director of Children's Health Ireland Dublin. And also, impressively, he was a member of the China Tribunal. And I'd recommend that you all go and speak to him afterwards to find out about that. So without much more ado, it's wonderful for you to give up your time, and really looking forward to your talk. Professor Martin Elliot.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Malcolm. Thank you, everybody. It's a real honour for me to be here and a privilege. It's also a bit scary, actually, standing in the Crick Institute where proper scientists live, and as a surgeon with hairy knuckles, you can imagine how I feel. I wanted to talk about the difference, really, between my experience with heart and heart research and what's happening in epilepsy. And I start with quite a lot of bias because I've spent my life operating on the hearts of babies like these. It's what I loved, it's what I found out I could do, and it took up most of my time. Probably my wife would say all of my time. At least until my life and that of my family changed suddenly and dramatically when on Friday the 13th, of course, 2009, my son Toby died suddenly at home during the night. We say now he woke up dead. He was 26, apparently well. He was a film editor at NBC News. And a year earlier, during what he told us was a nightmare, he'd bitten his tongue. And he bit his tongue the night before he died. A post-mortem told us that he died of sudden death in epilepsy. Actually, in retrospect, I'm not sure how they worked that out from the post-mortem. But neither I nor any of the 5 professors of medicine who were present at Toby's funeral had ever heard of SUDEP. We didn't know it existed. And we weren't alone. Only a third of Canadian pediatricians in 2011 working with children with epilepsy had ever heard of SUDEP. How can that be? Now, I'll leave you to read this definition, excellent definition from Lena Nasher. But what matters is that in England and Wales, 600 young people are dying of SUDEP every year. And that's probably an underestimate because the post-mortem reports are pretty lousy, and diagnosing it at post-mortem isn't great. Now, I'm a cardiac surgeon. Spent my life looking after the heart, and I know much more about sudden cardiac death, which has a similar number of deaths in England and Wales per year. That means between sudden cardiac and sudden death in epilepsy, we're losing a couple of thousand people a year to these 2 conditions, at least. That's an awful lot of classrooms, lecture theatres, nightclubs. Now, why is it then it's the same distribution, same terrible mortality that occurs, that heart funding for research gets such an enormous difference between that and at least 10 times difference between that and epilepsy? And if you just look at the research for sudden death, it's still twice as much for the heart as for epilepsy. Why should that be? Well, a lot of it is because it carries a stigma. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, people with epilepsy were shoved into housed in asylums. They were ostracized from society, kept out of public gaze. In London, at the Bethlehem, in the Ohio Hospital in Chicago, worldwide. And the stigma remains. This is a psychologist called Sally Baxendale who said the stigma remains worse than the seizures for many families. The other problem with the difference between sudden cardiac death and sudden death in epilepsy is that they take place or tend to take place at different times of the day. With sudden cardiac death taking place during the day and SUDEP classically or more frequently at night. So for sudden cardiac death often happens during the day. It's witnessed. It's often filmed in the modern era. Everybody's got a cell phone. And there's very often an ECG taken from the defibrillator that's taken out. That's what happened to Christian Eriksen at the Euros in 2020. Without the same success to poor Samuel just a couple of weeks ago in Nottingham. These get into the papers. If it leads, it leads. And it's easy to photograph and the evidence is strong. For SUDEP, they often take place at night. For example, in a student flat like this one. Alone, maybe away from home. And this creates a problem for both families and science because the body may not be found for some time. And there are, in Toby's age group, so 20 to 34, the causes of death are largely suicide or drug overdose. So that alters the way in which people approaching someone who's had a sudden event at night approach the problem. So that same scene suddenly becomes a crime scene. For many families, it's not a place of tragedy, but becomes a crime scene with police separating the loved ones from the victim, looking for evidence of foul play or suicide or drugs. It's hugely stressful, and for obvious reasons, it rarely reaches the media in a way which might be helpful to us wanting to make a difference. Now, interestingly, there are mechanisms in common to both causes of sudden death, and they may overlap, and they may help elucidate both cause and treatment. Some of the projects you've heard about have clear overlap here. Now, in both the brain and the heart, electrical signals are passed from cell to cell as a means of communication. The membrane polarity between positive and negative across the cell changes as sodium, calcium, and potassium ions flux across that membrane, creating a little spike which can be passed from one cell to the other. If the process goes wrong, abnormal rhythms or abnormal communications or abnormal exchanges of signals can occur. And underlying that, there's a whole bunch of mechanisms which are far too complicated to talk about, especially in this building, where scientists will strike me down with lightning if I get anything. But the abnormalities exist in these little channels which move ions backwards and forwards, called channelopathies, each of which, or some of which, have a defined genetic basis, as you've heard. And those working in the field estimate that there's a bit of an overlap between sudden cardiac death and sudden death in epilepsy of around 20% of overlapping functional abnormality. But there's a final common pathway to death, sadly, in both of these things, very commonly, and that's ventricular fibrillation. So those of you familiar with how the heart beats, because you can feel your own pulse, will know that it squeezes out a lump of blood which flows around your body and you can feel its pulse. If the heart rhythm changes, then the pulse changes, it becomes irregular. But with ventricular fibrillation, it's just like a bag of worms. No blood is ejected from this heart, and so no oxygen, no food gets to any other part of the body, including the brain, then you shut down and die, unless you're defibrillated. Now, in epilepsy, either simple epilepsy or multiple zigzag status epilepsy, which itself can induce a cardiac problem, a cardiac rhythm change, or the underlying problems which occur in stable epilepsy that might happen, so intense seizure or clusters of things, changes to your anti-epileptic drugs or underlying problems in genetics might themselves influence parts of the brain which I'm more familiar with, which involve how the lungs and the heart work. And that can occur because you don't breathe so well. You shut down your breathing. You shift the distribution of blood, or you become, you just don't breathe enough. That can happen in both chronic epilepsy and in status. And the end is that you end up with a low blood oxygen or not ventilating enough on a high CO2, both of which can then precipitate a cardiac rhythm change as well, causing VF and death. So that same cascade of events can end up in the same way. In the heart, we can do stuff to find out what's going on quite easily. So there's a couple of causes here. One where the muscle of the heart here, on the way out, is swollen and it blocks the way out of the heart, called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or you can have inflammatory changes in the heart called myocarditis, or the rhythm pathways in the heart can be disturbed. We're lucky we can study the heart quite easily using an ECG, stressed by exercise, or sometimes doing a structural MRI at the same time to find out much more about it. And we can have a look at how the heart's beating with an echocardiogram just by putting a probe on the surface of the skin. And nowadays, we can look for abnormal genes, and we can look for problems in the metabolome as well to look more closely at what's going on in that particular organ. Screening. Well, the problem is screening is not cheap. Screening US athletes, which is compulsory in pro sport in America, costs up to $1 billion per year, which is an awful lot more than they spend trying to sort out what the cause is. Well, we know why they want to screen them, so they don't have a cardiac arrest and they don't lose the valuable player, but it doesn't get us any closer to working on what's going on. But we have effective treatments as well in the heart. So we can, especially if ventricular fibrillation is the final pathway, we can use one of these things, which is an implantable defibrillator, which is like a pacemaker that gives you a big shock when it detects VF. And this is what Christian Eriksen had fitted and allowed him to come back to play for Brentford and possibly for Tottenham next year if the transfer deal goes through. What's good about this is that there's at least a 50% reduction in mortality if an implantable defibrillator is fitted. So something to detect the rhythm change, something to fire an electric shot in the heart and potentially reverse the problem. Wouldn't it be nice if we had something like that in epilepsy? But the problem is the risk factors for epilepsy aren't so clear-cut as they are for SUDEP, aren't so clear-cut as they are for me dealing with a sudden death in the heart. Some of these, nighttime sleep and prone, remain controversial. The rapid changes to drug regimen and early diagnosis, undiagnosed fits, remain a risk. And there are far fewer tools for prevention of sudden death in epilepsy than in sudden cardiac death at the moment. Even regular review is challenging. I sit on another organization where I was working with some GPs, and I was shocked to discover that they were paid to see people with epilepsy once a year. And for the last 2 years, where QOF, which is what the program's called, has been suspended, they haven't been seen at all. Primary care support for epilepsy is in a bad state. Now, much work has gone on in this field to try and detect a seizure about to happen. And you all know these things, you've probably seen them much more often than I have, lots of devices. I personally have a great fondness for these things, which have a wonderful nose. And I'm fascinated that support dogs, some well-trained support dogs, can detect a seizure about to happen 40 minutes in advance, wake somebody up, tip them out of bed, or go and fetch a relative, or even make a phone call, which seems stolen to me. I can't even work my phone, so but it does make you think that in a few years' time we might have a computer nose, that would be able to detect some of these things. And that happens with COVID. We found that with COVID, that dogs can identify COVID, that they've now trained a sensor which can identify COVID on the computer as well. So the problem is we're a bit more focused. There's a lot more money gone into cardiac research. And some of the genes have been identified a bit earlier than been happening in epilepsy. But SUDEP remains multifactorial, and as Sanjay said, it's really hard to find a final common pathway. There is no single gene. There's a lot of genes, and there's a sort of imbalance between lots of genetic variants, which are deleterious, and a less deleterious balance of genes on the general population side. The only way you can do this is to do more research and dig down deeper into the genome. Now, SUDEP victims usually have a post-mortem, sometimes an inquest. And we found the whole process completely unsatisfactory, slow, poorly communicated, and ice cold. For others, it's much worse, as the delays can be extreme, since the quality of postmortems and the delays in postmortems vary dramatically from place to place. There's a postcode lottery in how it works. I don't think that's right. We need good data. You're going to hear more about data later. Data is the key to all this. And there should be structured data collection. The Royal College of Pathologists have told us what to do. They've said, call in the clever people, the people who know about epilepsy, and find out a bit more about what's going on at the postmortem. If you're unlucky enough, as many are considered, to have to go to an inquest, the inquest is to determine the cause of death. Now, in my scientific naivety, I thought they might be doing something useful. But actually, they want to put you in a box called natural causes and exclude murder and suicide. There is little science. I'm still working on the coroners to try and change that, but it's a slow process. It's a legally driven process. Natural causes is enough for that. Looking at both these causes of death, I think that we can make some statements, and I believe this strongly, that we should standardize the investigation of all sudden deaths. I've listed it here, but you can see that the commitment to research is philosophically the most important thing I think we can do. We need a biobank where tissue from all of these people who are unfortunate enough to have landed up in this position can be stored for future use. And we need access to specialist services, not GPs who will see them once a year. And we need to sort this imbalance of funding out. It's not enough to give the dribble of money to epilepsy and a lot of money to stuff because people die during the day. They still die. The families are still affected. The consequences are the same. 20 years ago, Jane Hanna described SUDEP as deaths in the shadows and made this statement: it was under-recognized, under-reported, and poorly investigated. But I'm going to challenge not the first, but the second, and say it's under-recognized, under-reported, but increasingly investigated. We miss Toby every day. All the things you wish you could or should have said stay with you always. But the lost opportunities for the person who dies, for Toby, really hurt. Toby loved politics. He hated injustice, unfairness, and war. And in fact, when he died, he was editing a documentary for the charity War Child. It seems completely unbelievable to me that he didn't experience 2016 or Brexit or Trump or Partygate, that he wasn't there to shout at Trump on TV, which he undoubtedly would have done. And the behavior of Putin and his troops would really have horrified him. I think of him every day. We miss his infectious laugh, and that would have been triggered by the satire which came from all of those terrible things we've lived through in the last few years. So I want to thank you for listening. And please remember that it is your generosity that can and will make change for families and individuals and all of those who've been through the terrible horrors that these surprises can spin them. Thank you very much.